Welcome, everybody. We are in the process of letting in all of our participants, and so we'll get started in just a minute. We appreciate your patience. We'll give it just another minute. And as you're signing in, if you want to say hello to everyone in the chat box, that it's very nice to see folks. And Tammy, good morning from Hawaii. You don't have to rub it in, Tammy. Good to see some of my Philly colleagues. Nebraska, Wisconsin, Iowa, Montana. That's terrific. We've got New Jersey. We've got people from all over the country. All right. So I think we'll start. We have a lot of really good material, and we know that more people will be signing in, but it's 2:03, and I believe a 2 o'clock train should leave at least by 2:03. So welcome, everyone. My name is Sharon Easterling, and I work with Opportunities Exchange. And some of you may have joined us for earlier webinars. We did a series of 3 compensation-focused meetings back in the fall and early winter. We talked about salaries and how to start to move the needle on wages. We talked about health insurance and other benefits, and then we talked about working conditions and creating working conditions that attract and help you to attract and keep high-quality staff. And so when we did our session on benefits, we just really did a sort of a brief nod to the issue of retirement. But, you know, as we think about what we're trying to create in the field of early childhood education, it's really critical that we wrestle with this topic of retirement benefits. None of the folks who work in market-based childcare are going to have access to a pension, of course. And most of them, what we know from workforce studies is most of them don't even have any retirement savings. And we can't really expect people to make a career, spend their lifetime working in early childhood education settings and not really wrestle with the fact that we've got to be able to help people be financially whole when they're ready and able to retire. And so Opportunities Exchange is sponsoring this webinar really as an extension of that workforce series. And we're delighted to have an expert with us today, Gary Romano, who's the president and the CEO of Civitas Strategies. Civitas has been getting deeper and deeper into working with the early childhood community. And Gary will probably tell you a little bit about that, but they're working in several states doing some large initiatives that are really focused on helping childcare programs be more financially stable and sustainable. And OpX increasingly has seen a lot of intersection in our work with Civitas strategies. And so we thought this was a great opportunity to bring this content to you. Could you go to the next slide, Gary? So if you're not familiar with OpX, we are driven by these core values. We talk a lot about the business of early childhood education, but it's really in service of these core values. We believe that every director deserves an administrative team. There's a lot that a program director is required to do in terms of operations and managing the finances, and we believe that directors really need to have support in those tasks. We believe every teacher deserves pedagogical leadership, thoughtful, reflective practice to help us as education professionals constantly be asking the question, how can I serve my children and families better? And we believe that every child deserves a reflective teacher. Again, that thoughtful reflection on what am I doing and how can I better meet the needs of this child. Next slide. So let me just say about this partnership with Civitas Strategies that we have decided to sponsor another national conference. Typically, we wait 2 years. This time, we're doing it 1.5 years from our last event. We're doing this because, as you can tell from the theme of the conference, Change Now, things are changing really rapidly. And they're changing, and we need to also facilitate that change. We need a lot of change in the sector. And so we're going to be really focusing in that conference about how we can do things in a different way and how we can do things in a better way to make early childhood education what we know it can be and really live up to the promise of early childhood. So if you don't already know, save the date, October 2 to 4 in Phoenix, Arizona is the national conference, OpX and Civitas partnering together, and registration is going to open on May 1st. You'll be seeing emails about that. You can go to our website to access that information. So I am going to turn it over to Gary and let him take us through this really interesting topic of how we can create retirement instruments for our staff.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sharon. And so glad to be here afternoon, this morning, depending on where you are in the nation, depending on where you are in the world. And this really is a very exciting topic, as Sharon mentioned. I'm going to talk a little bit about why. For those of you who don't know us, Civitas Strategies, we're a 14-year-old management consultancy, and we've worked that entire time on a number of different topics, but particularly early learning. Before that, I also had experience going back 2005 at the systems level in early learning. And it really, since the beginning of the pandemic, we have gotten very deeply engaged, as Sharon mentioned, in working with providers directly and coaching them on through a number of statewide efforts, regional efforts that have existed. And in fact, we recently tallied up, and our team of 14 since 2020, March 2020, has had over 43,000 interactions with providers around the country. That includes our work in terms of coaching engagements, other things. We were honored back in May when Tom Copeland retired, who many of you know, to have him bequeath his site to us, including answering all of those questions that come in that way as well. And the only other thing I would say about this is, before we move on, is that what you're seeing is not academic. So we've actually been doing this coaching in states. We've been working with hundreds of providers on this and really homing in on what are some of the options and what is exciting about this opportunity. So this is, again, based on that experience as much as it is on the offerings that are out there. And what we're going to talk about today is, first and foremost, why is this a key opportunity in terms of compensation? And I think there's some obvious reasons, but I think there's also going to be a few surprises. I know there was for me. What childcare providers need to know and how shared service alliances and other intermediaries can help with this particular benefit. So let's go right into key compensation. By the way, if people have questions along the way, don't hesitate to throw them in chat. We could even do chat and have you come off at the end as well. So really three things that we want to talk about when it comes to this key opportunity. And the first two, I think, are ones that you may be familiar with: the need, compound interest, but there's also an incredible cost savings that we're going to talk about. So first and foremost, as Sharon mentioned, and it's been our experience as well, is that most providers, whether we're talking about family care, whether we're talking about centers, whether we're talking about owners in those centers, educators, family care providers, or their employees, right? There's little or no savings typically. And we know that that's going to be a need, right? And it's a need for retaining employees. It's a need for retaining owners in the industry, but it's also just a human need, to survive in the economy that we have. And right now, when you look at the average across different financial experts, it's roughly 80% of your pre-retirement income that you need. So for example, if you had a provider, and this is easy numbers for me, so please don't be offended in your area if this feels like a lot or little. But if you make 35,000 today, that means you need 28,000 a year every year from when you retire. So that's a pretty big nest egg that needs to be developed. So there's that need, that pressing need that's out there. And the sooner you start, the better, because of compound interest, right? And many of you may be familiar with compound interest, but this is the most important underlying piece of knowledge when it comes to retirement planning, right? And the idea is that your interest gets reinvested in your savings, and so it keeps getting reinvested. And what happens is you have a power curve, right? So you have a steep curve that goes beyond what you're saving because that interest keeps compounding. So let's look at what that looks like in an actual slide, right? An example. So here's an example that we had was, let's say you have a provider or you as an individual, right? I've done this for a few times and people or intermediaries have said, gosh, I feel like I learned a lot about my own retirement. So let's say you decide that you're going to forego $50 a month in spending. And again, I'm not trying to be judgmental, right? Maybe that's, one less night out or something for dinner. Maybe that's cutting back on Starbucks, which is one of my addictions. It could be a number of ways that you're freeing up that $50. And over the course of 30 years, if you keep putting that $50, just $50 a month, into a retirement savings, well, by the end of it, you've made 18,000. That doesn't feel too good. I mean, it's good for you, right? You save some money, right? So that's this blue line. But because of compound interest, the power of compound interest is that as you make money off that money, it gets reinvested. Now it's making money as well. And that's this power curve that you see here, this yellow one. So by the end of those 30 years, you put in 18, you've really made more than twice as much as that in terms of interest and the compounding of that interest. So at the end of it, you actually have $55,000. Now, again, when we looked at those numbers in the previous slide, this is, going to help. It's not going to necessarily get you there, but you get a sense of how the earlier you start, which is not to say if they start late, you say to a provider, it's too late, it's done, right? It's okay. But the earlier you start, the better because of this compounding interest. We're also going to talk more about it when we talk a little bit about what some of the opportunities are specifically for providers. This compound interest is going to come up, so do remember it. The last thing is the cost savings. And, having done, as I mentioned, our team, hundreds of coaching events with providers, individually in groups on retirement, this was something that I did not appreciate fully until we sat down to do this work with OpEx. And I probably shouldn't confess that, and I think this is, if again, we talked about like that last concept was the hardest one, right? This is probably, in my mind, the biggest moment of this presentation. So enjoy it while you can. But there are incentives that come with retirement that are really important. And I think many of the providers don't understand it. I know I didn't fully appreciate it till we were digging into this. I knew about them, and we're going to see what it looks like. But let's go through each one of them first. There's the Savers Credit, which is tax credit. There's a retirement startup plan cost tax credit, another tax credit, it's in the name. And there's also deductions on your income taxes potentially. And these really add up, right? So let me talk about what each of these are, right? And then we can also talk about how it all comes together, right? And so, you know, it's important to know as we go through this that there are going to be ones like the Savers Credit. Those are going to, you know, benefit individuals who are taxpayers. We do have ones like the startup credit that's going to help an organization that's doing this, right? This is going to work for family care providers. It's going to work for for-profit centers. Now, a tax credit, not as good if you're a nonprofit for the startup, but keep in mind what we're going to show you around the Savers Credit is still applicable to those educators, those other employees who may be employed by a nonprofit center. So the Savers Credit, it's a little bit more convoluted than this, and certainly in the pieces that Sharon referenced, there's more detail, but at the most basic level, what the Savers Credit is doing is giving you a tax credit of 50% of your retirement contributions up to $1,000. So in other words, if you put 2,000 in, you'll get 1,000. You put 2,500 in, you still get 1,000, right? Because it's up to $1,000. If you put less than that, if you only save $100, you still get 50 back, right? So I want to make sure you know that it's not about you have to hit 1,000. This is open to any individual. So this could be the woman who has her family childcare business. This could be an educator at a center, a nonprofit center, a for-profit center, doesn't make a difference. So this is something that's applicable to both parties. And it's really fairly significant if you think about that, right? Because if you are only doing, as we saw in that example, $50 a month, right? So $600 a year. Well, this is half that money back at the end of the year. And it's important to know, and we go into this in the materials a little bit more deeply, but you know, for those of you who may not be familiar and have a great love of taxes as I do, which I do, a tax credit always beats a deduction. And what I mean by that is, and we're going to talk about deductions in a minute, they're positive, right? But a deduction reduces your taxable income. A tax credit is treated like a tax payment, right? So in other words, if you have a deduction, maybe it reduces your taxable income, and at the end of the day, you're paying $100 less in taxes. That's great, but it's always a fraction of the deduction. However, with a tax credit, you are getting that amount that gets applied to your taxes, which is certainly more significant. So again, this is one opportunity. Another one is the retirement startup plan. And so this is another tax credit. This is available to the business itself. And they have to have W-2 employees who are not owners. So if you do have family care providers who are sole proprietors, for example, you know, this wouldn't certainly cover them. If they had W-2 employees, it would cover them. And what the credit is here is it's up to $5,000 in administrative costs for the first 3 years. So again, that could be pretty significant. For most smaller businesses, this is a significant, if not really all their administrative costs going away for those first 3 years, and also up to $1,000 an employee in the first year of the plan. And then there's reduced amounts over the following 3 years. And again, if you go to the documents that we have, it goes through how much it goes down, right? But at least that initial year, you're getting $1,000 per employee, which is pretty significant. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is the income tax deduction. And we're going to talk about some retirement plans that are tax deferred, right? Where you're going to pay those taxes later, right? Um, in general, the important thing to think about is that, whoops, excuse me, is that, typically you are with any retirement plan, you're either paying taxes now or you're paying taxes later. So many of them, like, you may be familiar with the traditional 401k. You're not paying taxes now. You do get the deduction now. When you retire, you pay taxes on that money as you take it out. In other cases that we'll talk about, you pay the taxes now on the money, and you don't pay taxes on what the gain on that compound interest, right? So there's always some sort of tax benefit associated with the retirement plan. And the question is it now or is it later? But there is that benefit. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about how these all come together for you. And so we have two examples, and these are real examples that came from our work, right? We have Kashan as a family business care business owner. She's a sole proprietor. She made $38,000. She put $2,000 into a simple retirement account. Don't worry about the type of account. Just trust me on this one, right? So in this case, Kashan has put in $2,000. She's going to get $1,000 on that tax credit. She also gets the deduction. So her actual cost at the end of the year for that $2,000 that she put in her savings was $454. And this is, by the way, where we started to get really excited about this opportunity, because we knew about the importance of this work. But when you start to see some of these numbers and how they add up, it's kind of incredible. Another example, this time we're going to look at Estelle, right? So Estelle set up a new retirement plan for her employees. She's doing 5% of their salary, so $1,560 for every employee, and it's a total of $23,400 that she's investing. She also had $2,550 in administrative costs. So when you look at her tax deduction on top of the amount that she's getting for the startup tax credit, now in that first year, she's really only spending $26.91 for all of this benefit to her employees. So as you can see, there's a tremendous leveraging opportunity. Now, as I mentioned, the startup credit does go down over the next few years. But even with that, you again could see that there's some immediate savings. The tax deduction doesn't go away, for example, and these savings continue. So it becomes a really interesting option as you think about ways that providers can increase compensation for their employees in comparison to others. So, when you think about some of why you should be doing this, why you should be thinking about this as you talk with a provider, what we see generally is that 93% of employees consider retirement programs a draw when making their decisions, right? It helps them prepare for the future. It helps you keep your current employees. It helps you attract new employees. Overall, right, you're getting it for a lot less with these tax credits and deductions. And again, some of them, like the Savers credit, is likely to continue for years. And additionally, and this was another big aha for us as we got into this work, is that selecting a plan can be much simpler than it seems, because we know that there's a lot of choices that folks have in retirement plans. So what we want to do is talk a little bit through these and talk about some of the basics of it, some of the choice navigation that goes on, right? So again, as we talk about retirement, what's most important? You want to be able to talk about and share information on the amount that's needed. A lot of providers don't really think about how much they're going to have to accumulate over the next few years. And so there's very often, it becomes a very binary system. They either don't want to talk about it at all because it seems like a number that's impossible, or they've waited, now they really don't want to talk about it. because it seems like it's impossible, but the conversation has to happen. And many times the challenge that providers have is that they have no idea what the amount is. And so it becomes something that's even bigger in their head. So starting that conversation with providers and helping them understand what the amount needed is important. Understanding how compound interest works is another area that we've seen where there's a disparity in information that the providers have, so they often don't know the justification for starting earlier. And then certainly these tax benefits, they often know it's deductible. The tax credits, they're often unaware of. And that's something that, because they don't know it, and I should say, with the Savers credit, a lot of, so I should say, let me take a step back. We do a lot of work with providers and their taxes, a lot of work. And, for those of you who have seen me talk about them before, generally, I feel like they range from poor in terms of preparation to criminal. And I don't say that lightly. We've seen malpractice many times, unfortunately. What I would say is, the Savers credit is something that often comes up, but not always with providers. And so having knowledge of it is important. The startup cost credit, never comes up. In fact, I don't know of any provider who had a tax preparer who got on top of that one or talked to them about it at all. So there's this knowledge asymmetry that's really a challenge in the field. Just this basics around what is the opportunity for the childcare business owner. And, one of the other challenges is choice navigation, right? And, if you are familiar with some of the choices that are out there when it comes to retirement, there are many, many, many choices. And when we started this, and we started counseling providers on their retirement and on setting up retirement plans for their businesses, we were unfortunately contributing to the overwhelmed. I was contributing to the overwhelmed, right? Because we would talk about there's all these different flavors and all these different types. And the good news is there are lots of options. The bad news is there's lots of options. However, what we found, and we're going to talk more about this in a minute through our work, is that we kept coming back to the same recommendations again and again. So really, is there a lot of choice? There absolutely is. However, when you come down to it, the number of actual choices that are likely to most benefit them is much smaller. And what's interesting is, as we talk about these, and I just did this a week ago with some providers, some family care providers, many of them, even when they're hearing it, have trouble absorbing it because it's often things that they haven't heard before in terms of options, because they gravitate to some of the more common ones, which may or may not be their best choice. So when we talk about, yeah.
I'm going to slow you down for a second because a couple of questions have come up, and what you just said, taking it in and understanding it, I want to have you do a do-over on the slide that delineates between the actual cost, the initial cost, the saving, and the actual cost, right? Can you walk people through that slide again? And then I also did not say this at the beginning, but we are recording this session and we will send you a link to the recording, and we will also send you the slides because you signed up for this session. So you will have an opportunity to read these slides again, listen to the presentation again, and even email us if you still have questions. So we'll go over all that at the end, but why don't you just walk us through this scenario one more time?
Absolutely. And I see Oscar was one of the people who asked the question. Hi, Oscar. It's good to see you.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing here is when we talk about the cost side, there's two types of costs. This $23,400 is what the provider is issuing in terms of the employer match, that 5% that Estelle is matching, is giving her employees per 5% of their salary, right? Now, there's a number of ways, and we do talk about this in the guide, that you can do that. We're assuming that this is a contribution that she is making regardless, right? So it's not going to vary based on, does Sharon put in 1%? I'll match her at 1%. There's a lot of ways to do it. And we do talk about that in the materials, but for ease of numbers, we're assuming that Estelle's doing 5% just across the boards, whether they put the money in themselves or not. The 25,550 are her administrative costs. So what's allowable under the tax credit under administrative costs are a whole bevy of things. So this includes if she has, let's say, a 401k, it includes some of the fees and charges that that organization, whoever is taking care of her 401k, would charge her, right? It also includes the time it takes her and any administrative tasks, administrative folks, to actually administer the plan. So in this case, what she's outlaid is the sum of those two, right? So between the administrative costs and the amount that she's given the providers, that's 25,950 that she's put out. That's this first column. The second column begins to show two ways that she's saving. So number one, these costs are deductible, right? So depending on her business type, whether she's sole proprietor, whether she's incorporated, she's going to save a fraction of that money because she won't be taxed on it. The other portion, the 17,550, is the amount of the startup grant, that tax credit we talked about that she would get back. And that includes two elements, right, that we could break down. First, it includes the 25,550 of her administrative costs, right? We're under the limit, she gets 100% of those costs back in the credit. We also know she had 15 employees, $1,000 an employee, $15,000. So that is where those two columns are coming up and coming from. So these ones right here in the middle. So that's how much she is saving. In terms of the actual costs, when you get at the end of that year, when she does her taxes, everything's prepared, the actual money that she lost out of pocket was 26, I'm sorry, not out of pocket, the actual money that she spent on this, right? Because she was putting more out of pocket along the way, was 26.91. So she's gotten some of that money back in taxes that she won't have to pay. And then the 17,550 helps pay those taxes she has incurred on other expenses, including maybe her own profit, right? And so at the end of the year, she's paid 26.91 for this 25,950 in value that came out at the beginning. So having that 401k or whatever the retirement plan was, being able to do the savings for her employees at the end of the year, that's the cost. Does that help?
Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. So if we talk about this information that providers need, again, this choice navigation was something that was often overwhelming to them, we found, and we still do find, right? And as we did this work, as we got deeper into the work with them, what we started to find was the same ones came up over and over again. And certainly, I don't want to make it sound like, there's everything is a foregone conclusion that they're not allowed to choose anything else. But what we found was these were consistently, as we evaluated options, the best choices. And what we've done is we've put those into a very simple flow chart, right? That you can use, by the way, because this is all offered freely, to work with providers or even just educate them about what those options are out there. And it leads to what's funny is when we did this, I sat down because I'm still a little bit of a pen and paper kind of guy. And I sat down and I started diagramming it out, and distilling and distilling and distilling. And what I came back to again and again was that there was really 4 scenarios. And these 4 scenarios were coming up in our conversations with providers, that these 4 scenarios were consistently well designed for the providers as well to meet their needs. And again, free choice, they don't have to choose them. But we did find that it just came down to 4 scenarios, which was interesting. And we do have some resources available that you can work with the providers and use or give to the providers directly. And so What I'm going to do is get a little bit tactical, and I'm not going to go into, as we do in the guides, every single kind of option there is for a retirement plan by any means. But what I do want to get into is I want to show you how this can be distilled rather quickly. And the flow chart that we developed was really two questions, right? Number one, how many employees do you have that you're going to be covering? Is it just me? And by the way, in the guide, it does say, and this is for brevity on the slides, me or my spouse, right? Because there are some opportunities for the spouse, if the spouse is not working, to also save towards their retirement through these vehicles through the company. Are you, whoops, are you under 40 is the next question. Are you over 40? These, and you'll see those in a minute, are really a function of that compound interest and where you tend to be in your career. I'll talk more about that. On the other side of it, we go to how many employees. If it's me and one or more W-2 employees, again, like we're not even going to go, because I know sometimes we hear about 1099 employees. We're not going to go there. That's a whole nother discussion for another day. So if it's you and one or more W-2 employees, the two questions that come after that are, do you want a set amount that you give every year? Or, every time that there's payroll is done? Or is it something where you want flexibility and you say, gosh, Gary, I'm doing really well this year. I have a bunch of money that came in through stimulus, but next year, I'm not sure if we're going to have enough to give them anything. Those are the variables. And from this, and again, we go through this in the guide, we really come up with 4 scenarios. So if it's just you or your spouse and you're under 40, it makes the most sense to start with a Roth IRA. And the Roth is not deductible this year. Remember how I said, like, it's deductible on one end of the pipeline for retirement or the other. In this case, a Roth is not deductible this year. It is, what you do get out of is the taxes on the other end. So the reason why this is advantageous if you're under 40 is that typically, and I know like we can all come up with examples on, well, this was different, right? But typically, and we do find this in general, but we also find this within the childcare industry. When you are under 40, you are making less than you do when you're over 40, right? So the amount that you're saving now through the deductions is less than it will be as you get more senior in your career, as you accumulate those years, as you move to other jobs, as you get experience that warrants getting paid more. And again, not always the case, but this is typical. So the deduction now may not be as great, right? Because you're not deducting that money now out of the Roth IRA, but you also have many more years than other people to affect that power curve. Remember, we saw how severe it was after 30 years, like how much it went up? Well, all of that money, so 2/3 of it would now be not taxable. It's a pretty good deal. So that's why we say if you're under 40, starting with a Roth is a good idea. And if you still want to go beyond that and you want to save more, doing a SEP IRA or an individual 401k are great options. Why do we point to those two in particular? They basically are no fee. I know we have to technically say no low fee because there are instances where fees can be charged for them. I've yet to find one, but I always say that as like a little caveat. Similar thing with individual 401ks and individual 401ks. If some of you experienced them like maybe 10 years ago, they were a lot more complicated. They've become a lot simpler now. And these are instruments that could be set up, in under 15, 20 minutes online. So this is not involving them, and we'll talk more about how you get there, but they don't necessarily have to do either of these vehicles with a financial planner or some big rigmarole. There's no annual reporting. It's all wrapped into the retirement plan that you're using, and it's basically typically free for you. So this becomes a really good opportunity if they do want to save more. A SEP IRA or individual 401k are deductible in the current year. And when we say if we have that individual or the individual and the spouse and we say they're over 40, we now flip it, right? Because chances are you're making more money now. That near-term deduction becomes more valuable. So then we say SEP IRA or 401k. So you can contribute more. And then if you kind of max those out, or if you want to mix things up a little bit and say, I want a little less taxable income when I retire, you would add a Roth IRA to it. But really, as you can see, pretty simple. And by the way, we've had providers set up their SEP IRAs and their individual 401ks and Roth IRAs themselves without issue. So I also want to make sure you know that that's, again, not like it's a guess or hypothetical, but they have been doing it. If it's just you, whoops, and we did this one, oops, sorry. So if you want to do employees and there's no set amount, this is one where you're going to want to potentially use a SEP IRA. It's going to allow you to, whoops, why it keeps doing that? There we go. Now we're on the right slide. Now, so you want to use a SEP IRA. The reason is, again, one, no cost, potentially low cost, but I've never seen it have a cost. Super easy to set up for you, for your employees. And you are allowed to make any level of contribution in a given year. So for example, let's say Meredith, I'm just picking on you, she has a childcare center. She sets this up. Again, this year is a great year. She doesn't know till the end of the year, right? So she doesn't even want to do it during the year. She sits with her accountant at the end of the year and says, gosh, we did well. Let's put some in retirement for folks. She can do that. She could do it throughout the year if she wants. And then the next year, if she's not doing as well, she can give less. She can give nothing, and that's okay. And that's not the case with every retirement option. So this becomes a really interesting one because it does afford you that opportunity as the employer to vary it. And then when we look at, you have employees and you want to give a set amount, a simple IRA is typically a good option. Again, no cost, low cost. You can do a match with it, for example. So if you want to say, gosh, Janice, if you give 2%, I'll give you 4%. But if you give 0, I'm not giving you anything, right? And I'm not trying to say it with any sort of disparagement or anything. There are different ways to do it and different incentives you may want to provide employees. So, it does provide the opportunity to do some matching with it. However, it is very hard to change the amount from year to year in a simple IRA. If you want to offer an even bigger match, if you want to get more complicated, a 401k is your best option. But that is where you start getting into, it does cost more money to run a 401k, whereas a simple IRA, low, no cost. A traditional 401k will have costs to it, especially depending on the add-ons you have. So that becomes more complicated, which is fine. If you want to go to complicated land, you can go there. 401k is a great option, but if you want to have something that's going to be defined year after year, an easier, simple IRA is an excellent choice. So again, when we think about, what happens with the providers, they're navigating this, really there's two options. And we've heard a lot of people say, gosh, do they have to go to a financial planner? Do they have to, what do they do next? Is this something where they need to set up their own plan? Typically what we found with providers is online self-service is easier than ever. It's cost effective. They can get these plans set up in a minimal amount of time, typically for no cost with the options that we're talking about. And, those are your Fidelities, your Vanguards, et cetera. And going to those sites, filling it out, not hard. We had some providers just last week who were telling us about their experiences that were very positive. You can go to a financial planner, and what we recommend is two things. One is if they do opt to go to a financial planner looking for somebody with CFP, which is a certified financial planner, they've had some testing, there's some independent monitoring, there's a code of ethics, which leads us to the other point, which is that they should come armed with information. And one thing we have found is, unfortunately, and this is not, I want to make this sound like childcare is being preyed upon in particular, but we have found a number of cases where providers have gotten retirement plans which probably were not the best choice, and some of them they can get out of, they can transition out of, others are more permanent, unfortunately. And so what we always say is make sure that you're armed with information, whether it's those choices we just talked about, and kind of say, you do want to go to a financial planner, you want their advice, maybe start with why not these, as opposed to what's everything in the world that I may choose. And some of those things may be more beneficial to the financial planner than the individual making the purchase. So how can you help, right? If you're a shared service alliance, if you're an intermediary, what can you do? It's actually relatively straightforward. There's little or no investment that you need to help with this. And I mean that sincerely. I'm not trying to oversimplify things. In fact, in the conversations that Louise Stoney and I had about this very early on, she kept battle testing this with me and saying, like, but are you sure there's nothing? And really there isn't. It's the challenge is one that's informational more than anything. As you can hear, right? It's about knowing the choices. It's about knowing the benefits, it's about prioritization. It's about accessing those credits. So when we think about sharing, right, you can share that better understanding of fundamentals of retirement, right? Share the information with those providers. There are free tools that, as Sharon mentioned at the top of the conversation. You can find those at our site /retirement. You're welcome to use those, and you can make them into presentations, whatever you please, right? But that becomes a way of starting to share that information, because as we talked about, the biggest challenge is that information barrier. And so now you're leveling that playing field, you're helping them have information. You can also integrate this work into your existing work, right? So it could be your existing business coaches, if you have them, can also talk about this, right? And it could be done in one session. We do it all the time in one session, right? And in that session, you're helping the owners understand what the benefit is, right? Sharon, here's the benefit of this, here's what you could be doing. And then also helping them to make choices and to say, here's the justification for those choices. So whether you go on Fidelity and try to choose from the many options on there, or you go to a certified financial planner, you're at least armed with what you should be asking for. And certainly, if you have the resources, if you have the time, helping them pursue setting up the plans with them could be helpful with them or their team members. You could definitely make this a higher end service, but even then, you're helping them sign up. It's not like you're running your own retirement plan for them. So again, there's a lower burden there. So I do want to make sure that we do see there's some resources, as Sharon mentioned. We're going to be sharing the slides. I know, Sharon, do you want to go over the OpEx ones, or I don't know how deeply you normally go into them?
No, I don't need to. You can go to our website. I put some links in there, but I would just urge you to check out the financial management toolkit. Is sort of a comprehensive approach to business coaching to providers with some specific things around the compensation strategies. The right side of your screen are the Civitas resources, and I do want Gary to sort of walk you through what those are.
Yeah, absolutely. The first link is for these retirement resources that we're talking about. And again, as Sharon mentioned, there's an issue brief that we developed with Louise, and that then links to 3 different pieces that we have on retirement. So it takes you through each of those key steps, gives you much more information about it. I know Oscar had mentioned the fade out of the Savers tax credit does fade out. We talk about that in there. We also talk about the fade out of the administrative tax credit that's there for starting a new plan. Those are all in there in detail. So again, we're keeping this high level here. There's more detail, but it's in there. And by the way, it's not overwhelming. We also have a variety of tax resources. We still are in tax season, my favorite time of year. And that includes ways that providers can or you can do this with them, self-assess their taxes, apply, using TurboTax themselves and other online software, as well as just getting ready for tax season and we have an organizer there that we do with homegrown childcare every year. There's financial resources, staffing as well. Again, these tools that the providers can use. Everything, by the way, is in English and Spanish on those sites. And then finally, as we mentioned, we were kind enough or lucky enough to have Tom bequeath his site to us. So we continue that work, especially if you're working with family care providers. It's a treasury, but also we find if you have a mid to small size center, also useful. And again,
So
if you want more information, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yes, all of our website. Why don't you leave the previous slide up, because that's got all of our URLs on it, and we'll do a Q&A. And then if people want to, go explore some of that while we're chatting. So a couple more questions that have come up. One is, what's the minimum percentage a child care center or home providers usually match? I'm not sure I understand the home provider. I guess you mean if a home provider has an employee or one or more employees or centers. So for employees, what's the minimum percentage that an employer would usually match? Minimum, typical, what's the range?
Yeah, so typical minimum is depending on the plan is 0, right? And we talked about that. So for a SEP IRA, if you want to set that up, you don't have to do that in a given year, which could relieve a tremendous amount of pressure, by the way, when we work with providers on this, especially those who are looking at a lot of funding from stabilization. It helps them feel good that they can say, next year, I don't have to do this. And I'm not saying that with any value judgment, but it does say that, right? It does lead to insecurity on the part of the employee, right? Because they don't know what they're necessarily getting, but you can do that. So the minimum would be 0. And by the way, you can do some of these, again, just based on their salary. You don't have to do any sort of matching scheme. Typical is anywhere from 3 to 5%. Nationally, you do see up to 7% as being an average, but we're finding more 3 to 5 is more typical in the industry.
Gary, can you say something about the use of brokers? We, at OpEx, we talk to people a lot about the issue, particularly around health insurance. And we say to people, we have directors who say, I spend a lot of time going online and looking at plans and trying to figure out, and we say, talk to an insurance broker, or in the case of the ACA, a navigator or an advisor, right? Like tap the expert. Now I know you can do this on your own. What are the advantages and disadvantages of finding someone to help with this? And how do you know if you've got a good one or you've got a good plan or that you're not getting ripped off? What did you look for?
Yeah, I mean, so let's start with how to find one, then we can talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So how to find one, always ask people, do they feel comfortable, right? Can they have a personal referral? Always the best way to do it, because then you have somebody who's experienced it as being honest with you. Barring that, or in addition to that, going to the CFP, the Certified Financial Planner webpage. Again, this is an independent organization that certifies them. They have a basic level of education. They have to pass 4 different tests before they can be certified. They have to have years of experience. So it's not just something simple. It also gives you other recourse. So if there's a challenge that you have, you can go to that body, and they do have a code of ethics and they do regulate the planners. So it provides you with a little extra protection. In general, what we found is that if you're going to go to a certified financial planner, the advantage is they should be helping you plan your entire financial life in some way or another. And you may not want your entire life planned, right? So you may say just focus on retirement, but they are giving you a broad picture, or they have that capacity. The disadvantages, as I mentioned, is that typically the industry is one where you pay based on either the assets that you have under their management and or by fees. And so what we have found is, unfortunately, even with certified financial planners, that many providers have gotten options that weren't necessarily in their best interest. A classic one, and we can go into it ad nauseum if you ever wanted to, is annuity, which is awesome if you're selling them. Not so good if you're using that as your primary retirement vehicle. And so, we see that a lot, that there'll be, there'll be traditional 401ks, traditional IRAs that are given when there could be business use that would be a lot better and more advantageous for the provider. So if you do go with, that's where we recommend still use this information, bring it with you and say, fight me on why it shouldn't be this, versus
Mm.
going in there and saying, advise me, because unfortunately, many times they're not thinking about just what's best for you, but also thinking about what's best for them, even though they're not supposed to. So that is the disadvantage there.
Yeah. And if you're going to do it yourself, and it sounds like if you're making modest, you know, if you're talking about a small group of employees or a modest level of contribution, at least to start, maybe doing it yourself is not a bad way. Are there some, I mean, I don't know if you can name names, but are there some institutions that are better in terms of fees and, you know, the cost, some that are better than others?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, you know, I think that if you look at Fidelity, and these are also ones that I've used over the years as well, and I've done comparison shopping on Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab, all have, and they would hate me for saying this, remarkably similar experiences and offerings. The online systems are good. They'll even help you figure out how you should invest the money all online. So you don't need any sort of advising. They're free, you know, to you. They're getting the work done very quickly. They will typically have links set up for your employees. Guideline is another one that's affiliated with Gusto. If you use that payroll company, that is quite good. But I would say stick to some of those big ones. The only big one that I've heard anything negative about lately was T. Rowe Price, which frankly, I probably wouldn't advise anyway, because they tend to have, you know, kind of a higher end demographic that they're pushing to. But
Yeah.
I do know, not a provider, but a small business that recently had reported to me online that they were having a lot of problems with T. Rowe Price. But otherwise, the usual suspects in this case can be good options. And I'm not saying that everyone should go to a big bank or big institution, but in this case, they do it well.
Good. So you have the ability to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question live, or you can continue to put questions in the chat box. I'm just scrolling back through and making sure. There is a cap on the saver's credit when you get above a certain salary or household income, which can be the limiting factor. Other questions, observations? Anyone want to share an experience that was especially good or especially not good?
I can actually jump in, Sharon.
Yeah.
And I can testify that with Gary's help, I set up actually, it's not retirement though, is it? It's health reimbursement.
You can still pitch it. That's okay.
Yeah.
Let them know.
It wasn't a retirement fund. It was actually a way to be able to deduct health expenses from my taxes. And Gary was able to help me do it in about 10 minutes. And it was like my accountant knew it existed, but I needed Gary to actually give me the forms. Once I had them and I set it up and I sent it to my accountant, he was like, oh yeah, that's cool, we're good. So sometimes this stuff seems more complicated than it is.
100%. And Louise is mentioning Section 105 plans, which, you know, I know some of you in the audience today have heard me talk about all too much. But anyone ever wants to learn about them, let me know. We have some materials that are in the public domain. Exactly like Louise says, it takes almost no time, and providers can start deducting those healthcare costs that normally aren't deductible. So it's a really neat vehicle and super easy to administer themselves.
One of the things that it seems to me that on a shared service alliance or, you know, a network could, you know, you had a slide that said, how can you be helpful? It seems like one of the things you could do as an alliance or a hub is to actually do some of that vetting, right? And to figure out, is there a broker in our community who's especially good? I have been, some of you know, you've heard me talk about the ACA and how we really need to get the childcare workforce connected to the deep subsidies that are available. And I have had very different experiences getting folks that use a health insurance broker have said, ask for some help on this topic. I know of an organization whose broker has been a tremendous resource and helped them set up supplementary savings, those instruments that Gary was talking about. So people are getting their very affordable health insurance, and then they're getting wraparound supplemental insurance products and additional financial help. And then I know of other folks who have gone to their broker who said, no, you can't do that. We can't help you. So not all brokers are the same, right? And alliance leaders can really help by finding folks in their community who are mission-minded, who understand what it is that we're trying to do for the workforce and are willing to come along and alongside of us and be partners. It's a really critical role.
Absolutely. Other questions, thoughts, experiences?
Well, looks like everybody got what they needed, or they're deep in thought and don't quite know what to ask. However, as I said earlier, you can contact us. If you go to that last slide, Gary, I think, oh, it's just, you know what, it's just the OPEX. Where's yours? Yeah, put yours up that has your.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you
so
want,
people can go ahead.
No, I'll just put my email in as well. You can just feel free to email me if you have questions, thoughts, things that come up later.
So yes, you reach out to anybody, reach out to Gary, reach out to anyone on the OPEX team. If we can't answer your question, we can help you find someone who can. So Gary, I want to thank you for putting this material together. I want to thank you for the direct help that you're giving to providers and to intermediaries, and remind you all again that we are planning a fabulous conference in Phoenix, Arizona, October 2nd through 4th. We'd love to see you there, and registration for that's going to open very soon in a couple of weeks, May 1st. So thank you all very much for coming. Over the next couple of days, you'll get a link to this recorded session and a PDF of all of the slides. And again, you know where to find us if you have questions. So thanks, everybody, and we'll sign off.
Thank you.